Now, I want to say that pretending to be somebody we are not is a pretty big thing in our world. Pretending to be somebody we're not is actually a pretty big thing in our culture. It's so big we rarely think about it. Reality TV has nothing to do with reality. Social media is all about, carefully curating this public image of who we are, carefully presenting what we want the world to see, keeping all the other things hidden. Pretending to be someone else is a big part of our culture. And it's so easy to pretend to be something on the outside while not being congruent with who we are on the inside. Sadly, even in church, we sometimes put on masks for a variety of reasons. We put on masks to seem like we have it all together. We put on masks so people would like us. We put on masks so we could connect and be part of things. All cultures pretend to a greater or lesser extent. It's pervasive in our world. Christians in our story understand the Genesis 3 lie is the problem behind this. Because from the beginning of our story, we were intended to be something different. Our identity was rooted in someone different. And outside of that intention, we begin to be somebody else, living a false self into the world. If we were to continue to read our story before Genesis 3, in the beginning, in chapter 1, we read that God said, let us make humanity in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. It's an important statement. What we hear God saying is the intention for women and men before the fall, by God's design, would not simply to live together, would not simply to exist, would not be even simply to just coexist. The intention was to be increasingly more deeply known by one another. More deeply known by God, more deeply known by one another, and more deeply know who we are. This was the community that God was creating with our truest self. And so at the core of who we are is this image bearing, is this intention of who we were meant to be. And God invites us to be our unique selves before Him, not pretending to be someone else on the outside that someone else who we're not on the inside. The intention was this congruency that was ripped apart. What we find here is the reality that God has made us as these whole people. And this image includes, as we talked about last week, the physical, the spiritual, emotional, intellectual, and social dimensions of who we are. The overlap and connection between knowing ourselves is so that we could know God. And it begins with this part, is that we're holistic dimensioned people. We recognize that how we feel about who we are actually matters in the world. So the things that are happening in us actually matters for who we are. What's going on in our interior self actually matters for how we're being shaped and formed. It actually matters how we're being, whether we're shallow or deeply formed. If we were to reread verse 25, 26, 27 that I just read, the two of those, we would see that God saw what was good in His creation. And He saw what was very good in His creation. In other words, God delighted. He relished, He beamed with delight over us. The implication of this is that God feels. And if you're made in His image and God thinks, that means you think. And if God feels, that means you feel. You are a human being made in God's likeness, and part of the likeness is to feel and to embrace the feelings that you have. Peter Scazzaro puts it this way: ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality, and reality is where we meet God. Emotions are the language of the soul. Emotions are the language of the soul. There's a passage of scripture that I read often. I read it because it helps me to go inward for myself. It helps me to reflect on the things that are going on in my life. And it's one of my favorite passages. It's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to read out of the Luke passage. But the passage is about it reflects so much on the original lie. that led humanity into disobedient chaos. And it's a story of Jesus' temptation. It serves a purposefully juxtaposition between temptation of humanity that happens in the garden with half-truths to the temptation that happens in the desert. Here's what we find in the Gospel of Luke, verse 3. The devil said to him, to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." And I often read this, and there's a lot of parallels with bread and nourishment through the whole scriptures, and it's like a whole wonderful story, so there's a lot to say there. But there was a moment here in studying Scazzero that I haven't noticed that he points out. And he suggests that there's a universal temptation that happens in this line, in this temptation to Jesus, that happens to us. And he suggests that this first temptation is the temptation that I am what I do, the temptation of performance. Jesus had apparently done nothing. We don't know what he's done before this. There's 30 years that have happened. We know he was born. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in the birth story. We celebrated at Christmas, and then we kind of don't know anything, and then all of a sudden, he's going to begin his ministry. But he hasn't done anything yet. He didn't really have a following yet. He's hungry. The temptation is, what have you done? What contribution have you made to the world? Who are you? Our culture asks the same question of us, doesn't it? What have you achieved? What are you good for? Note the hints of the lie in this temptation. Earthly success tempts us to find our worth and value outside of God's presence and love, outside of the garden. The second temptation we read, the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It all has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want. Now, if you worship me, it'll be all yours." The second temptation and lie that Jesus and we face is, I am what I have. That my possessions define me. We begin to play a comparison game. Who has the best house? Who has the most perfect family? The most interesting or comfortable life? You don't have those things. Who are you in this world? Performance and possessions. Then the third lie, the third temptation. Then the devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully." The tempter invites Jesus to throw himself down from the highest spot of the temple so that people may believe in him. At this point, people didn't think Jesus was anything. It was all confused. Who is this guy? Like, John seems to think he's great and baptizing him. He can prove his value if he does this, right? So the third temptation and lie that Jesus and we face is, I am what others think of me. Popularity. Performance, possessions, and popularity. When we deny our pain, when we deny our losses, when we deny our feelings year after year after year, we become less and less human. The moment in the garden that has led us to step out of that communion actually made us less human than God intended. The renewal of all things is entering back through God, through his grace in Jesus, to be fully human, to be fully who we're meant to be. Our false self attempts and avoids and tries suppressing our emotions and our feelings, and it is an unhealthy way to cope. But what happens is when we consciously or unconsciously begin living someone else's life and someone else's expectation of us, we become less and less who we're meant to be. Friends, I want to suggest that does violence to us. God says who we are. God speaks to who we are.